They made up their minds before the season ever had a chance to breathe, before the playbook settled in his head, before the pocket collapsed around him for the first time. Before a single mistake could even be logged, the verdict was already floating through timelines and talk shows. Bust. Overhyped. Product of a famous last name. It didn't matter that none of it had been proven yet. The story was too convenient to wait for facts. And once a narrative like that gets rolling, it doesn't ask permission from reality. That's the part most people miss. This was never just about football. It was about optics, about what happens when expectations get set so high and so unfairly that anything short of perfection feels like failure. From the moment Shedeur Sanders stepped into an NFL building, he wasn't measured like a normal rookie. He was measured against a legend, against a brand, against an idea people already felt strongly about. And when that happens, patience disappears fast. You could feel it in the way his name was spoken, not analyzed, not evaluated, but framed. Every throw came with an asterisk. Every calm response got twisted into arrogance. Every quiet moment became proof that he didn't have it. The conversation didn't sound like development. It sounded like anticipation of collapse. Like people were waiting to be right instead of waiting to see growth. What made it worse was how fast the noise drowned out the details. The early mornings, the late film sessions, the way teammates quietly started trusting him. None of that trends. None of that fits into a hot take. And so it got buried underneath louder, easier storylines. Nepotism plays better than nuance. Doubt travels faster than patience. And once that version of the story took over, it became almost impossible to rewind. The wild thing is, this isn't new. The league has done this before. Confident young quarterbacks get labeled before they're ready, systems fail them quietly, and when the results don't come fast enough, the blame goes exactly where the spotlight already was. But this situation hit different, because the pressure didn't build over time, it showed up fully formed. Day one, like the end had already been written, and everyone was just waiting for the chapters to catch up. And that's why this story matters, because when you dig past the headlines, past the leaks, past the injury chatter and the talking points, what you find doesn't line up with the conclusion people rush to. The tape tells a slower story, the work tells a quieter one, and the gap between those two truths is where everything started to fracture. Because once a narrative is decided, every moment after gets distorted to support it. And what came next wasn't just scrutiny, it was a test of patience, belief, and whether proof still matters when perception has already taken control. From the outside, it was easy to reduce everything to one word: nepotism. Say it enough times, and it starts to feel like an explanation instead of an accusation. The idea was simple and convenient. The name opened the door, the spotlight did the rest, and the work? Optional. But inside the building, that version of the story never really matched what people were watching unfold day to day. While the narrative online stayed obsessed with bloodlines, the reality on the ground looked far less glamorous. Shedeur wasn't floating through practices or leaning on favoritism. He was early, consistently. Not in a ceremonial way, but in the quiet hours when the facility hasn't fully woken up yet. Film on, notebook open, already dissecting concepts most rookies are still trying to memorize. Coaches noticed it, so did teammates. That kind of preparation doesn't care who your father is. The confidence people love to hate didn't come from entitlement, it came from repetition, from knowing the install cold, from understanding why a protection failed instead of just blaming the line.
And that difference matters, because confidence built on shortcuts collapses fast. Confidence built on preparation is steady, almost boring to watch if you're looking for drama. That's why it got misread. Mechanics were another easy target early on. Social clips slowed down every throw, hunting for flaws, ignoring progress. But week by week, the small things tightened. Footwork smoothed out, release time shortened, reads got cleaner. These weren't viral changes, they were developmental ones, the kind that only show up if you're actually paying attention instead of searching for confirmation of what you already believe. There was also a quiet shift happening in the huddle. Veterans started listening. Receivers started adjusting routes mid-rep because they trusted the timing. That doesn't happen because of a last name. That happens when a quarterback earns it, rep by rep. And it's subtle enough that most people never clock it until it's already established. What critics kept calling arrogance showed up very differently in person. It looked like calm, measured responses. No over-explaining, no chasing approval. When things went wrong, he didn't sulk and he didn't deflect. He took it back to the film room. That's not swagger, that's focus. But focus doesn't satisfy people who are waiting for failure. It doesn't give them a clip, a meltdown, or a soundbite to run with. And that's where the gap widened. The louder the nepotism talk got, the more the preparation side disappeared from the conversation. One was easy to repeat, the other required attention. So when the stakes inevitably showed up, as they do for every rookie, they weren't framed as part of learning. They were framed as exposure, as if the work had never been there at all. But inside those early weeks, the groundwork was already laid, the habits were forming, the trust was growing. The problem wasn't effort or readiness, it was that the public story had already been written, and preparation rarely gets the chance to rewrite a headline. And just when it seemed like the work might start changing minds, something happened that flipped the conversation completely and drowned out everything built up to that point. It didn't start with a game. It didn't start with a bad throw or a blown read. It started with a voice. An off-record conversation that was never meant to live in public, suddenly ripped out of context and dropped into the middle of an already unstable narrative. In the moment that audio surfaced, the story stopped being about development and turned into damage control. The clip spread fast, too fast for fact-checking, too fast for clarification, too fast for anyone to slow it down and ask basic questions. In it, Shannon Sharpe was heard discussing what he claimed was frustration coming from Shedeur's camp, hinting that he might be done with the situation in Cleveland. That was all it took. Within minutes, the wording shifted online. Frustrated became finished, concerned became checked out, and speculation immediately filled in the gaps, as if they were confirmed facts. It's important to say this clearly. The audio was never a public statement. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't Shedeur himself speaking. It was a second-hand account that reports claim was shared privately and then leaked without context. But once that nuance disappears, it's almost impossible to put it back. Headlines don't thrive on caution. They thrive on implication. Shannon tried to walk it back, not fully, but enough to signal that things had been overstated. By then, it didn't matter. The clip had already done its job. It reignited every doubt, every quiet suspicion, every lazy take that had been sitting just beneath the surface. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about how Shedeur was progressing. It was about whether he wanted out, whether he trusted the organization, whether he was already planning his exit. And here's where timing matters. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened while the Browns were still sorting out their quarterback situation, while leadership questions were already swirling, and while patience in Cleveland was already thin. So instead of being viewed as one person's perspective, the leak got folded into a much bigger story about dysfunction, instability, and inevitability. What made it more explosive was Shannon's reputation. He wasn't a random voice chasing attention. He'd been one of Shedeur's more consistent public defenders. So when that voice hinted at frustration, people treated it like confirmation instead of commentary, as if someone who believed in him must be seeing something everyone else missed. But there's a difference between frustration and quitting, and that difference got flattened instantly. No one stopped to ask what kind of pressure a rookie quarterback might feel in a chaotic situation. No one asked whether frustration might come from wanting more stability, more clarity, more commitment. They jumped straight to the most dramatic conclusion because drama was already what people expected. Inside the building, nothing actually changed that day. The routine stayed the same, meetings happened, rehab continued, prep didn't stop. But outside, the tone shifted sharply. The audio leak didn't reveal a secret plan.
It gave people permission to believe the ending they'd already decided on. And once that seed was planted, every moment after was filtered through it. Silence became confirmation. Neutral quotes became red flags. Any setback became validation. The match had been lit, and no amount of context was going to put it out easily. Because the moment speculation feels like insider knowledge, it stops being questioned, and the next chapter of this story wasn't going to be written by words at all. It was going to be written on tape. Here's where things got uncomfortable for the narrative, because while the noise got louder, the tape started telling a story that didn't line up with the panic. And game film doesn't argue. It doesn't care about headlines or leaked audio or expectations tied to a last name. It just shows what happened, snap after snap, whether people are ready to admit it or not. When Shedeur took the field, nothing looked rushed. That was the first thing that stood out. The pocket could tighten, pressure could flash, but his eyes stayed downfield. No happy feet, no frantic bailouts. He wasn't trying to be a hero, and that alone separated him from a lot of young quarterbacks who feel like they have to prove something every play. Instead, he managed the game, and ironically, that's what threw people off. The reads were clean, not flawless, but deliberate. He got through progressions, checked out of bad looks, took what defenses gave him instead of forcing highlights that weren't there. Ball placement showed intent. Tight windows weren't accidents. They were choices made with timing and trust. That's not what not NFL ready usually looks like on film. Even under pressure, the poise held. You could see it in 2-minute situations, where most rookies speed up and start overthrowing. Shedeur didn't. The tempo stayed controlled, the mechanics didn't fall apart. His footwork stayed disciplined, and his release time actually improved as the reps stacked up. Those early criticisms about sloppy mechanics didn't just fade, they got disproven quietly, which is the worst possible outcome for a loud narrative. There was a particular stretch that changed how people inside the league started talking. Against real competition, with defensive looks designed to confuse him, he stayed composed. He didn't light up the stat sheet, but he didn't hand the game away either. Low turnovers, smart decisions, efficient drives. It wasn't flashy enough to trend, but it was effective enough to matter. And that's where the disconnect became obvious, because the same voices calling him overrated weren't breaking down coverages or timing routes. They were skimming box scores or waiting for a meltdown that never came. When it didn't, the conversation just stalled, as if people didn't know where to go once the evidence stopped cooperating. Coaches noticed. Analysts who actually watched the tape noticed. That's why the internal evaluation didn't match the public outrage. Promotion didn't come from hype, it came from consistency, from a quarterback showing the same calm decision-making whether the moment was quiet or chaotic. You don't advance in an NFL building off a surname. You advance because you're executing the plan. But instead of recalibrating the story, the criticism just shifted. If he played well, it was safe. If he didn't force throws, it was limited. If he avoided mistakes, it was system-dependent. The goalposts moved because admitting progress would mean admitting the narrative was wrong. And that's when it became clear. This was never about waiting to see if Shedeur could play. It was about waiting for him to fail. The film refused to give them that moment, so the frustration turned subtle. Not louder, just colder. More dismissive. Because when the tape shows growth and the storyline demands collapse, something has to break. And what broke next wasn't his play, it was the patience around him. By the time Shedeur walked into the building, the problem had already been there for decades. You don't need conspiracy theories to explain it, you just need history. The Cleveland Browns have been searching for quarterback stability so long that instability became the culture. New season, new plan. New coach, new scheme. New quarterback, new promise. And then, almost on cue, the reset button gets smashed again. Over 30 starting quarterbacks since 1999. Let that number sit for a second. That's not bad luck. That's organizational whiplash. It's a pattern of impatience disguised as urgency, of short-term fixes sold as long-term vision. And every quarterback who walks into that environment inherits more than a playbook. They inherit pressure, skepticism, and a countdown clock that starts ticking immediately. This is where the conversation around Shedeur stopped being fair, because evaluating a young quarterback in Cleveland has never been the same as evaluating one anywhere else. Mistakes aren't treated as lessons, they're treated as confirmation. Every missed read becomes evidence that the search has failed again. Every quiet game becomes proof that this isn't the guy. There's no runway, there's barely even a warm-up lap. That's why voices from outside the building started getting louder. Jason Kelce didn't mince words when he talked about it. His message wasn't complicated. You can't keep throwing quarterbacks into chaos and act surprised when none of them stick. Development requires patience, structure, and trust. Cleveland has offered none of those consistently, then blamed the player when things fall apart.
What Kelce pointed out hit a nerve because it forced the spotlight off the quarterback and onto the system. Cleveland doesn't just struggle to develop talent, it struggles to commit to it. The moment adversity hits, the evaluation becomes reactive. Benching, scheme tweaks, quiet depth chart shifts. All of it signals panic, even when the language says process. And it doesn't stop with fans or radio shows. Players feel it. Coaches feel it. When quarterbacks know one bad stretch could send them back to the bench permanently, decision-making tightens, freedom disappears, growth stalls. Suddenly, it's not about learning the position, it's about surviving it. This is why Shedeur's situation feels familiar in the worst way, not because he's played poorly, but because the environment doesn't know how to nurture progress without demanding immediate payoff. Cleveland hasn't just rotated quarterbacks, it's rotated philosophies. From rebuilds to reloads, from youth movements to win-now gambles, the message changes faster than players can adapt. The curse isn't mystical, it's structural. It's a franchise that keeps expecting different results without changing how it defines development. And when a young quarterback enters that system, the burden shifts unfairly. Suddenly, he's not just learning the league, he's carrying the weight of every failed experiment before him. That's the backdrop Shedeur stepped into. Not a clean slate, but a graveyard of unfinished plans. And once you understand that, it becomes harder to treat his story as isolated, because the problem Cleveland keeps wrestling with isn't whether their quarterbacks are good enough, it's whether the organization ever gives them enough room to become good at all. The injury didn't just stop him from playing, it changed the entire tone overnight. One moment the conversation was tense but manageable, the next it flipped into something far more toxic. As soon as the word back entered the discussion, the whispers came back louder than ever. Fragile, breakdown, another one that couldn't hold up. It didn't matter how minor or common the injury was, the timing made it irresistible. In this league, injuries are expected, especially for quarterbacks adjusting to NFL speed. Bodies tighten, hits accumulate, and precaution gets mistaken for weakness. But context never trends. So instead of talking about monitoring workload or smart recovery, the narrative jumps straight to conclusions. Was this a recurring issue? Had he been pushed too hard? Could he even handle the season? Questions stacked up faster than answers. What rarely got mentioned was the lead-up. Reports had suggested that Shedeur had been dealing with discomfort for weeks and continued practicing through it. The decision to shut him down wasn't reactive panic, it was conservative management, the kind teams say they want when it comes to protecting young players. But when you're already under scrutiny, smart decisions don't get credit, they get spun. Photos from the sideline made it worse. A stiff walk here, a grimace there. Every frame froze into proof of a problem bigger than reality. Social feeds treated body language like medical records. Analysts who hadn't seen him throw in weeks suddenly spoke with certainty about his durability. The bust conversation didn't return quietly, it announced itself. And yet, behind the scenes, nothing about his approach changed. Rehab became routine, film study doubled, meetings stayed locked in. You'd see him on the sideline fully engaged, headset on, talking through reads, breaking things down with receivers.
That doesn't make headlines, but it matters inside a locker room. That's how leadership shows up when the stat line can't.
The irony is how familiar this part of the script is. Early injuries have touched some of the league's best quarterbacks. Missing time isn't a career verdict, but when an injury aligns perfectly with an existing narrative, it becomes ammunition. The same people who demanded patience when talking about the organization suddenly ran out of it when judging the player. The whisper campaign fed itself. If he was out, it meant doubt. If he was quiet, it meant trouble. If the team avoided specifics, it meant they were hiding something. No interpretation leaned neutral. Everything tilted negative because that's where the story wanted to go. But the injury didn't reveal weakness. It revealed how fast the football world turns on young quarterbacks when the environment is already unstable. Recovery stopped being about health and started being about survival, not just of the body, but of reputation. And as the whispers grew louder, something else started to fade. The support, the clarity, the certainty that the organization and its young quarterback were moving forward together. What replaced it was silence, and silence in this league is rarely just silence. At first, it was subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking for it. Answers got shorter, praise turned generic, eye contact disappeared from press conferences, and then the pattern became impossible to ignore. When questions shifted toward Shedeur's future, the responses from the top stopped carrying conviction. Head coach Kevin Stefanski didn't criticize him. He didn't defend him either. He stayed in the middle, using language that sounded safe but revealed very little. Developmental timeline, part of the plan. We're evaluating everything. On paper, that's standard coach speak. In context, it felt like distance. In the NFL, silence from leadership speaks louder than criticism. When a coach truly believes in a quarterback, he says it plainly, especially when the noise gets loud. He closes ranks, he sets a tone. And when that doesn't happen, speculation rushes in to fill the gap. Suddenly, every vague quote becomes a headline. Every non-answer gets read as hesitation. What made this moment especially uncomfortable was the contrast. Earlier in the process, there had been visible engagement, hands-on coaching, sideline conversations, real-time feedback. But after the injury and the media storm, that energy cooled. Whether it was strategic deflection, internal uncertainty, or simple self-preservation, the message changed, and players feel that shift immediately. This is where organizational pressure complicates everything. Stefanski's job security isn't abstract. Cleveland expects results now, not in 2 years. When coaches start coaching for survival, development becomes riskier than caution. Backing a young quarterback publicly takes confidence. It also takes insulation, and Cleveland hasn't exactly been known for providing that. So instead of anchoring the conversation, leadership let it drift, and drift in this market turns into doubt fast. The lack of affirmation didn't mean Shedeur was done, but it did mean he was alone in the court of public opinion, left to interpret silence as everyone else did, as uncertainty. Inside the locker room, players kept it professional. Outside, the vacuum grew louder. Analysts wondered if the organization was hedging. Fans asked if patience was already wearing thin. And without clear messaging from the top, every theory sounded plausible. This wasn't about one press conference or one quote. It was about accumulation, a series of moments where belief wasn't reinforced when it mattered most. And in a league where perception can steer careers, that hesitation carries consequences. Because when leadership goes quiet in the middle of chaos, it doesn't calm the storm, it legitimizes it. And that silence set the stage for the next voice everyone was waiting to hear. When Deion Sanders finally spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't call anyone out by name. He didn't go scorched earth, even though plenty of people expected him to. Instead, he chose something far more pointed: restraint. And for someone who understands media storms better than almost anyone in football, that choice said more than a rant ever could. Asked about how his son was handling the transition to the league, Deion didn't rush to defend stats or argue timelines. He went somewhere deeper.
Pressure is nothing new to him. He's built for the lights, but not everybody wants to see him shine. It sounded supportive on the surface, but underneath it was a warning. Not loud, not emotional, just honest. Deion knows how this works because he lived it. He's seen how confidence gets misread, how expectations shift the moment a player doesn't fit the image people want to project onto them. And he understands that when a system starts doubting quietly, it becomes dangerous, not because the player lacks ability, but because belief starts eroding behind the scenes. What mattered most wasn't what Deion said, it was what he didn't. He didn't promise dominance, he didn't demand special treatment, he didn't frame Shedeur as a victim, he framed him as prepared, built for scrutiny, capable of growth. That's not a defense, that's a reminder. The subtext was clear. The pressure surrounding Shedeur isn't about his performance, it's about perception, about proving people wrong instead of being allowed to develop. And when a young quarterback spends more energy surviving narratives than learning the position, something in the system is broken. Deion also understands timing. He waited until the noise had peaked, until silence from the organization became impossible to ignore. Then he spoke calmly, letting everyone draw their own conclusions. This wasn't a father interfering, it was a veteran recognizing a pattern he's seen end badly too many times. There was also a line he never said out loud, but didn't need to. Talent isn't the issue here, support is. And if that support never fully shows up, decisions get made that people later pretend were inevitable. Careers reroute quietly, opportunity moves elsewhere. That's why his words landed. They weren't emotional, they were surgical. A signal that while Shedeur was focused on his job, someone was watching the bigger picture closely. Someone who knew when belief starts slipping and what that usually leads to. Because this story was never just about a rookie quarterback struggling or succeeding. It was about whether the environment around him would match the work he was putting in. And that question was no longer hypothetical. It was approaching a moment of reckoning. When you strip everything else away, that's what this comes down to. Proof versus perception. One of them is loud, emotional, and spreads fast. The other is quiet, methodical, and shows up on tape.
Whether people want to acknowledge it or not. And right now, those two things are moving in opposite directions. Perception says Shedeur is unfinished, overexposed, maybe even expendable. Proof says he's improving, preparing, and handling pressure in a way most rookies don't. Perception looks at silence and assumes doubt. Proof looks at habits, consistency, and response to adversity. The gap between them isn't accidental. It's been built by impatience, by a system that confuses urgency with development, and by narratives that formed long before evidence had a chance to catch up. This was never about asking for special treatment. It was about asking for something far more basic: time, structure, belief. The same runway given to countless quarterbacks in better situations. The kind that allows mistakes without branding them as failures. The kind that lets growth happen without demanding perfection as the entry fee. Cleveland now sits at a familiar crossroads. Build or start over again. Choose patience or repeat the cycle that's defined the franchise for decades. Because if the organization decides based on perception, the ending is predictable. Another name added to a long list. Another reset justified with hindsight. Another what could have been. But if they decide based on proof, the story changes. The tape already shows a quarterback who protects the ball, understands the playbook, adjusts, and doesn't fold when the spotlight gets hot. Not a finished product, a foundation. And foundations don't look flashy until something real is built on top of them. The truth is, Shedeur isn't broken, he isn't exposed, he isn't a cautionary tale. He's early. And in this league, being early is dangerous if the environment doesn't have the patience to meet you there. Some players crumble under that weight. Others sharpen because of it. What happens next won't just define a season. It will define whether this team finally learns from its own history or adds another chapter to it. Whether they bet on the noise or trust the evidence that's been there all along. Because long after the headlines fade and the clips stop circulating, only one thing will matter:
Not who talked the loudest, but who was right.